Hi, everyone. This is my talk, Mind Your Own Business View Controller. We're going to talk about architecture and slightly provocatively, I guess. So this is me. I'm Peter Saxton. You can find me at CrowdHailer, on Twitter, on Slack, on GitHub, etc. I work at paywithcurl.com. We're a mobile payments company. They insisted I use this picture. I'm just going to put that out there. We did also go curling, but yeah. So I want to start this with a story. So this is a pull request, which I contributed to Phoenix. So this is pull request 2989, and it's merged. So it's in Phoenix Master. And this was the discussion around it. It's hot stuff. It was clearly loved. And so now you're probably really excited. OK, explain MVC, like the details of MVC. What did I do? So this is what I did. So I replaced MVC with Model View Controller. And because you should explain your acronyms, it's important. This is the first time, and in fact, the only time the acronym is used in the Phoenix repository. So perhaps we should go a little further. Like, if for any of you who are wondering what Model View Controller means, we should explore a little further. So Phoenix is a web development framework written in ELixir. And it implements the Model View Controller, MVC. And it should be familiar to those of you who are familiar with stuff like Ruby on Rails or Python. So who in here is familiar with Ruby on Rails or Python's Django? So that works for quite a lot of people. But unfortunately, as that's all you can find on MVC, the next step was to go and look at what it actually means. So I went to the Rails guides. And the Rails guides say, if you go through these guides, you'll understand the basic principles of MVC. You won't, actually. They don't mention it much either. They tell you what a controller is. They tell you what a view and a model is. So you might get one implementation. So if you decide to learn MVC from Rails, you'll learn just enough to really confuse you when you come across ecto schemas. OK, so let's appeal to some more figures of authority. So this is Martin Fowler. So he says this about Model View Controller. Probably the widest quoted pattern, and it's also the most misquoted. So I wasn't going to read all of this out, but I can't find the bit I wanted. Oh, it was in here somewhere. Anyway, a little while later, MVC assumes we are manipulating regular Smalltalk objects. This is from the same page. So at this point, I had a couple more questions. But like MVC, it's not everything, so I wanted to take a step back. What is good software? Like, the point of using a framework is to get advice on how to build good software. And the architecture should support that. And so what we want is we want software that communicates purpose, supports evolving requirements, and can be validated. Being testable is perhaps, there's discussions on how exactly, but it would be good to check that our software did the same thing every time, and we knew what that was. So MVC is just a tactic. And what we need is a strategy. Like, how do we get to that goal? So I like this quote. So strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, but tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So if you use MVC and perhaps don't understand why, this is the risk you run. So now I want to introduce some more acronyms. So this is DDD, which is domain-driven design. And at first glance, it can sound like one amongst a family of sort of competing philosophies. But it is different. It's worth looking at. And the reason is it focuses on the strategy. Like, domain-driven design at its core doesn't tell you anything about what you're going to end up building. I like to summarize it as you discover your design, you don't choose it. So if we have a mechanism for improving our design, it doesn't matter if we're a bit off on version 1. So domain-driven design talks about a few things. So what is domain? This is quite a wide definition, but it's a coherent subset of the universe. So that could be translating cookbooks to astrophysics, like anything. Then we have a model. So we have a useful representation of this domain. That one, beware overloaded term, but this is what they mean by it. We have a ubiquitous language. So a ubiquitous language is just a way for people who are developing the model to talk to people who are experts in the domain. And then we have a context. So the context is the setting in which all of the previous things happen. So understanding the limits to our domain. And then there are a few tactics which are used. These are indeed less important, but it'll be helpful to just cover some of them. So we have value object. So a value object is an object whose identity is characterized by its attribute, and they should be treated as immutable. So simple things like integers, we all know about immutability. So the integer 3 is always the same as the other integer 3. There's no identity outside of that. A good example is addresses. So if you get the same address, you get to the same place. This is what 3 words, which is a project to address everywhere with just three words. So this is where we are. We're at create duck chip. It's only a 3 by 3 meter square, so this is possibly where I am, but not where you are. And then we have entities. So entities are essentially the flip side to value objects. They're a concept that is defined by its identity, and they can evolve over time. So an example of this would be an order. So this is the same order as when it was in the factory. It's been marked as dispatched. And I can't complete this by having a squash package, but it was meant to be delivered here. Finally, so that's all about how we model internally. All useful software must eventually talk to the outside world. So domain-driven design and other architectures talk about ports and adapters. So a port is an interface defined inside the domain, which specifies something that it wants from the outside world. And an adapter is how the outside world implements what the domain wants. So in this case, we know that our domain has things like notifications and users, and at some point we want to alert the user that something happened. Doesn't really matter how that happens, and we could create an SMS, because I'm a bit retro, adapter to do that. So putting it all together. So this is a whistle-stop tour through domain-driven design. I encourage you to read more, but this is where we end up. So we end up with this core kernel of business logic. So the business logic is where those entities and value objects, and importantly, the ports live. And then outside it, we have adapters, which is what the real world does to interface with the thing we just built. There are lots of different types of adapters. This diagram separates them into 2. So they have this concept of primary adapters, which is input going into the domain, so web requests, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have something like the database, which is where the business logic makes a request to the database. I don't think this is necessarily a helpful clarification. You can write a program which receives emails and updates a dashboard, in which case you've reversed this. So the boundary is the most important thing in this diagram. And lots of people have discovered round-ish things, which you can use to describe this kind of architecture. All of these are good reads, and I will share the slide. You can get lost going through all of them. But fundamentally, they all have the core domain, and the outside world depends on the inside world. OK. So let's get back to MVC framework. So what do we know about the MVC framework? It had a models directory, a views directory, and a controllers directory. That's something. I did have an extra comment here to remind myself, but I thought I could do it. Phoenix doesn't do this anymore. Phoenix now has separated the web directory from essentially the core other part of the directory. That's progress. That's good. That's a nice way to do things. However, I still would say this. An MVC framework is the realization that the last project we did was REST endpoints to update a database, and the hope that the next one will be the same. It often is. Seems fair enough. So you can see this and what it means. So this is from the guides for Phoenix Forms. And everything in here makes a lot of sense. It's clear, it's easy, it's convenient, all of those things we like. It does have a change set. So that's interesting. So the change set is a term that comes from Ecto. So it's about how you would update the database. Now, the change set itself is reasonably database agnostic. So we could argue that the change set comes from the domain, and it's understood by both the web front end and the database. That would be an argument to make. And I would say, when did you ever get a change set back from popping from a map? So it's a database construct. It's agnostic to which kind of database you use, but that's where it comes from. And I don't know which screen to point at in this setup, but if we go back to this diagram, one of the characteristics of MVC is it's picked 2 of these adapters and made them unduly important. So if you're making a REST application, the API controllers are very important, and the ORM is very important. And actually, if you were to just inflate those, then you would have a layered architecture. So we're talking about similar things. We're just emphasizing different parts of it. And a framework which gives you the API controllers and the database layer runs the risk of making assumptions about the bit in the middle. And it does this for convenience. So again, these are all trade-offs, so that's where you get to. So if your application has endpoints that look very much like database tables, it's a fair assumption. You can have a completely different application. For example, one that just receives text messages and then sent an email when you got 100. It wouldn't be so helpful. And so this is now a tool for you to sort of think about what you're doing. An interesting thing about this is because frameworks are hunting for adoption, let's say that way, they're a product to sell. When you new a Rails project, it includes a mailers directory. And what it's doing is it's now decided, we got those two covered. A lot of people send emails. Let's deal with that adapter as well. And so we can encompass that. And eventually, maybe they'll do the whole world. But that's, of course, an ambitious goal, and that's where you need to understand your limits. OK, lessons from DDD. So if you're following domain-driven design, all models are wrong. I really like this quote. I'm going to read it out. Since all models are wrong, the scientist cannot obtain a correct one by excessive elaboration. That's a good point. On the contrary, following William of Ockham, I did not know that was his first name, he should seek economical description of natural phenomena. Just as the ability to defy simple but evocative models is the signature of the great scientist, so over-elaboration and, interestingly, over-parameterization is often the mark of mediocrity. Basically, a simple model you can get a lot with is really valuable to find, and getting to simplicity is hard. Next, isolate the model. So the model is important. That's what you're focusing on. That's what you're delivering. Use ports to obscure the infrastructure detail. Start from lib, if this is a more sort of ELixir way of dealing with it. And if you do these things, so particularly the clean architecture, they talk about times when they made prototypes, they had configuration, and someone was like, we should put that in the database. And they're like, OK, we'll just start with it hard-coded. Then they had it configured from end variables. Then they put it in a file. And then they were like, actually, file is fine. We don't need a database. So they just never had the overhead of dealing with the database. That's the promise of this. Again, doesn't often happen. You can see these things up front. So functional cohesion. This is, so who's heard about separation of concerns? OK. So going back to Pal's talk from this morning, they contrasted the layers, so grouping things by infrastructure, et cetera, versus grouping things by what they do. So functional cohesion is the second one. Functional cohesion is when parts of a module are grouped because they all contribute to a single well-defined task. There are other types of cohesion, and this is a really interesting read. So types of cohesion on Wikipedia lists them from worst to best. So worst has, can't remember what worst is called, but it's essentially, I think it's just incidental cohesion. So that's like a utilities directory. You put stuff there because you can't think of anything else. The next worst is logical cohesion, where you group stuff by what they are. So that is grouping all of your models together because they're models, grouping all of your controllers together because they're controllers. You know, if you had 1,000 controllers, you would probably want to consider more like this. And again, this is going back to Phoenix and our world. This is what I consider to be the goal behind contexts. Contexts allow you to group stuff by their function. Tests are just one adapter. So by having a well-defined domain and the clear entry points, you can exercise the domain by just having your first adapter be a sequence of tests, and then your second adapter to be the UI framework. Very nice way to go. It gives an answer on sort of what level to test. And again, unit tests inside, well, only if they help you get to your goal. But this is what you need. You know, for a certain output from the world, does it show the world what we want? And finally, so know your limits. This is really important. So there was large discussions around what a context was. The term is a bounded context in a lot of places in the literature. And the reason for this is if you don't know your limits, your model will expand. So this is the concept of a passenger to an aerospace engineer. So when they test planes, they put in these barrels. They weigh somewhere around 70 kilos. They take half the water out when they want to see what it's like empty. This is not a good model for training these. Doesn't work at all. So like a full model of a passenger would have to model everything, including their trials and tribulations and whether they had children. And that would be a lot of effort when you just wanted to test if your plane could take off with the appropriate weight. So yeah, know your limits. So in every model you come across, the leaner you can get it, the more economy you can have when developing it. So the more you can get out from a smaller model. So now we come on to the the bit of the talk, which I guess a few of you expected. So what is an MVC framework? So there's a couple of things. Firstly, it's not a framework. The second point on here, we're going to do these backwards, don't call us, we'll call you. It's important because the domain is the most important thing. The infrastructure doesn't get to assume anything, basically. And don't corrupt the integrity of the domain model, no matter how helpful you might think you're being. So that's the thing where the model that goes from a database row, which maps to inside your thing, and then out to the web form, it's very helpful. And if that's what you need, that's what you do. But there is the corruption in the middle, which, if it's not what you need, is tricky to unpick. So here it comes. This is what I've been working on. This is what I use for a variety of projects. And it's not important about this because you can do exactly what I'm going to say with a lot of libraries in the ecosystem, but obviously I know it very well. So first things first, this is what an endpoint looks like. And the most important thing here is, it doesn't have line numbers, the line where we call myapp.authenticate. So the web is a part of the real world. And on the web, we have HTTP requests and we have HTTP responses. So business logic is where the certain username and a certain password should be authenticated. How that username and password got delivered to the application is not part of the business logic. And so very clearly, we have a separation from pulling those parts out of a infrastructure-specific format and then putting them into our business logic. Of course, testing the authentication here would be quite easy. You just put the two values in there. Writing a command line tool, you would call it at exactly the same point. You could email in your authentication, and we could give you a one-time code, and we can make an email adapter, a postal adapter, like whatever you wanted. So that's the most important thing there. Again, so second thing it tries to encourage, and this is not something it really gives you, but is functional cohesion. So there are no directories given to you because it's not a framework. But essentially, I normally organize everything by under, say, www directory. At this point, the interesting thing is I don't make any separation between templates and controllers or actions or whatever you want to call them. The login controller is right next to the login template. So if you want to change that, if you want to add a new field to the form, you have the smallest amount of up and down your file tree. That's sort of like the symptom you're looking for. If you can change everything in one file, that's great. If they're next to each other, that's good. If they're up and down the file tree, then you've got a cross-cutting concern. I normally take this further, so I have the pattern I use for my URLs is actually I might one controller for so here we have two handle requests. The first one is get, which returns the login page, and the second one is the post, where we would do the authentication we showed before. So both the get and the post on the same action are in the same controller, and then the template is just one file next to it. Finally, one of the things it does, and now this is an ongoing discussion in ELixir, and if you'd like to talk to me about this afterwards, this is something I'm very interested in discussing. So ACE is the server that implements the racks layer. It's the same as the separation between cowboy and plug. And in the top one, we can see compile time configuration. So when we use this, we say we always want it to be served over plain text or clear text. And what is accepted as the argument to this use macro is essentially all the configuration that you can supply at runtime, but if you supply them here, they're evaluated at compile time. So if you did a system.getEnv or called something here, it would be evaluated at compile time. In the bottom one, so if we go to the bottom one, there's the same arguments, but supplied at runtime. And there's no argument about how you do that. They're just arguments to a function. You can get them any way you want. So the line above could be like, get the port from the environment, get the port from Vault, get the port from whatever other way I want to. And if I knew the port was always going to be the same, because say I'm deploying in Docker and I don't need it to vary, I can add that port argument to the top one as a compile time thing. So it then is no longer a runtime concern. This obviously is not useful for pre-existing libraries, but it's a great way to write ELixir projects to be configured. And because it's left the ability to start on demand, a big problem with configuration is if it's global. So a web interface might not be the only one. You could have a project which has one ELixir project running, and you have a dashboard and the front web page, or you have the front web page and here an admin panel. And so because all the configuration is just provided to a start link function, I can start as many as I want in a supervision tree, which is an excellent tool for managing your domain, and you then just keep adding things to it. So these were just some of the takeaways like I wanted to say, which I'd led to at this point. I would encourage you all to read more about domain-driven design. I think it's possibly the most valuable thing I've ever looked at in my years of doing software. So yeah, any questions?
Thank you, Peter. Questions? Yeah. You tried to wait a bit, but it just came out.
Thank you very much. So you went a bit into where MVC coming and all. Have you dived more into the history of the MVC?
Yes. And so this is an incredibly large topic and has been used as a shortcut to getting people to read your blog for a long time. I would say that the original paper in which the term was coined also had the concept of model, view, controller, and world. So that was a very interesting thing. They separate the concept of what the real world is doing and M, which is the model that is abstracted from it. It also describes the model as an abstraction or a set of abstractions. So I would argue that the original MVC was much closer to the mind your own business view controller because it talks about having one model, which is the model of the system, and then views, controllers, it has executors, presenters, which are pieces that you use to influence and look in that model. So I think we've slightly just lost the term since then, which is why I often say MVC framework, because that's sort of more specific. But yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah, I'm mainly saying that because if you begin to search it a bit, and it's hard to get information about history, but the creator of the idea and all still has a website somewhere where he's saying that basically no one knows what it means, even himself, and please don't use it.
Okay.
So,
yeah. No, my suspicion is model is a too easy a term to overload, and something quite as explicit as mind your own business is a little hard, it's unlikely to be sort of you would subclass from the Rails class mind your own business. So that's safer.
But yeah, and for people interested, there are still research for the past decade. The creators of the term MVC, among other things, has papers over the years trying to explore how to use it and what it means, and most of the time it's end up with he doesn't know.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyone else? Oh yeah, there you are.
Thanks for the talk, really insightful. My question is, given that Phoenix is moving more to borrowing concepts from DDD, which shortcomings did you find in Phoenix that made you write your own web, not framework web?
So there are other things. So I started this project as an intellectual curiosity on some comments I had about Plug, and we can talk about that some other time. But it's Phoenix in many ways doesn't have shortcomings if you know what you're building with it. I think all frameworks have a balance between getting you started from day one, which the previous talked about for getting people on board, and by doing that you have to make some assumptions. So I particularly want to talk about the framework for understanding those assumptions, and I think no matter what Phoenix does, no matter how much it includes stuff like a context, if it gives you the shape for your domain, it's not doing domain-driven design. One of the arguments about the context, which I was interested in, and I think is quite important, is because the generators force you to define a context on day one, that's the time when you know least about your domain. So iterating forward versus, OK, so let's generate the admin domain. It's unlikely you're going to get the correct one. So actually, when I use Phoenix, I've not started a Phoenix new project for a while, but I would recommend just making a context called core, because in 6 weeks you might actually know what you want to extract to your second domains. So it's impossible for them to provide that up front. So as a toolkit, it's useful. As a framework, it has the same shortcomings as all other frameworks. And just because you can separate the model layer from the web layer doesn't solve it, because someone will make an authentication plugin which goes, well, if you have the model layer and the web layer, this is the authentication plugin you can use, which immediately sticks them back together. So, yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, come in.
So this might be a beginner's question, but what resources would you recommend to understand better how to define your context with things? I
mean, searching around domain-driven design is the right thing to do. it's quite a subtle conversation. So you understanding some of the basic terms. So when I learned domain-driven design, I started with a whole bunch of the tactics. So I learned about the entities and the value objects. And then they talk about repositories, which are interfaces for the database. And once I'd got a handle on sort of 4 or 5 of those, I was kind of able to be like, okay, so the guiding principle is, if none of these work for me, I throw them all away. But it's almost too abstract. It's a little bit like explaining people a monad. Like, it's too abstract to go from the top. You have to see some and then pull it out. And it is an experience-driven thing, I would say. So you can't, because a small project will have only one context. That's the problem. You only see it beyond a certain size.
Oh, good? Yeah? Okay, then thank you, Peter. Thank you for your talk.